The Russia-Ukraine war is in real peril right now from the Ukraine side. The Ukrainian army is starting to show signs that it may be in the early stages of a collapse, especially on its eastern front. And by the summer, according to some estimates, the entire Ukrainian army front line could collapse and create a breach that through which Russian forces could roll unhindered into the interior of the country. That kind of situation seemed incompatible, inconceivable to many in the West. And in fact, to many of our current leaders, it still is conceivable. Now, if you've been watching Daniel Davis Deep Dive for any time, this won't surprise you at all because we've been talking about the fundamentals that go underneath building national combat power have been continually moving away from Ukraine and in the direction of Russia. We keep pointing out exactly why. It's not just empty rhetoric or just a feeling, but it's always based on, substantive issues on the ground, historical things that go into building combat power, et cetera. Unfortunately, it seems that many of the Western leaders are just still not getting it. And if they start to pay attention even among themselves, because now dysfunction even within the alliance, within the leadership of the Western countries that are supposed to be supporting Ukraine, they're now starting to crumble and fall apart. And this is happening inside of Ukraine politically and diplomatically and outside within their support. And you're going to see why that the risk that is already being talked about by other people today is not without merit. And this should prompt a change of policy that the United States, especially in the West generally, should start to pursue like yesterday. But certainly we need to start changing things going forward. We can't go any more forward with this blind optimism that's based on nothing but sheer fantasy and desire at the exclusion of the on-the-ground reality. Now, first of all, before we actually jump into some news that's breaking just today, actually just within hours ago, especially coming out of Moscow, there's some things that have been said that you need to know about. But to set the stage for that, first I'm going to show you, some of you have seen this before, but Vladimir Putin said something on the eve of this war, about a couple of weeks before it started in 2022, that is very, very consistent and should have been listened to by our leaders at that time, but we didn't. First of all, here's what he said on February 7th, 2022.
Я хочу еще раз все-таки подчеркнуть это. Я говорил, но мне очень бы хотелось, чтобы вы меня услышали все-таки в конце концов. И донесли это до своих читателей, зрителей и пользователей в интернете. Но вы понимаете или нет, что если Украина будет в НАТО и военным путем будет возвращать себе Крым, европейские страны автоматически будут втянуты в военный конфликт с Россией. Конечно, потенциал объединенной организации НАТО и России несопоставим. Мы понимаем. Но мы также и понимаем, что Россия одна из ведущих ядерных держав. По некоторым компонентам, по современности даже многих опережает. Победителей не будет. И вы окажетесь втянутыми в этот конфликт помимо своей воли. И вы даже не успеете глазом моргнуть, когда будете исполнять пункт 5 Римского договора. Господин президент, конечно, не хочет этого развития. И я не хочу. И я не хочу. Поэтому здесь и находится.
So he admitted there, frankly, that he knows that conventionally he cannot compete with NATO. Can't do it. He said there definitely the balance of power is decisively in the conventional realm on the side of NATO. Russia can't match it. No matter what they do, how much output they may have, they can never match the combined total of power that can be created by the NATO side. But he said, if it gets down to it, if this turns into a war of the NATO side or the Western armies against his because he knows he's outmatched, it's going nuclear. And he said, I don't want to do that because no one would win, because it could literally end civilization as we know it. That's what he said in 2022 as a warning to then French to French President Macron when he went to visit him in Moscow right before. So now that in the news the last few days, again, Macron is in the news because now then, instead of learning any lessons that we should have learned over the last 2 years, now he wants to up the ante a little bit and now then openly muses about the possibility of some NATO troops actually going into Ukraine, actually going in to fight Russians on behalf of Ukraine. Nothing's off the table, he mused. which of course sent alarm bells off in Russia. And today, Vladimir Putin, speaking before his country, addressed Macron again.
They should eventually understand that we also have weapons, and they know it. I just said it now myself, weapons that can hit targets on their territory. Everything that the West is coming up with now, what they threaten the world with, it can result in a conflict with the use of nuclear weapons, and therefore the destruction of civilization.
So he more directly and emphatically said at this time, we can go nuclear, but everyone's going to lose. And it could literally be the end of civilization. There are too many people who these days don't recognize just how profoundly true that is. The chances of it happening should be minuscule. It shouldn't even be a legitimate possibility. But the fact that now everybody's talking about it on both sides, and especially the guy who's on the lower end of the conventional power balance between the Western side and NATO, Russia by itself, people with nuclear weapons will use them if they feel existential threat from the other side. If they feel that they're going to be attacked and they don't have the capacity to resist it, and it's either use nuclear weapons in an attempt to escalate the situation to prevent the destruction of their people, they're going to do it, just like we would do it, frankly. Is if like there was some alliance of China, North Korea, Russia, whatever, and somehow in some distant future, all of a sudden they're moving against us and our armies. I assure you, no American president could ever say, I'm going to allow the U.S. armed forces to be defeated and not use our nuclear weapons and allow us to be defeated. It'll never happen. And it won't happen on the other side either. That's supposed to be mutual deterrence with the mutual assured destruction theory that is almost certainly going to be accurate. Why are we even moving in the direction of even toying with that? It's absurd and it's insane because the conventional situation on the ground between Russia and Ukraine is decisively on the Russian side, and it's only increasing by the day. We talk about this a lot, and I've said that a second ago. Some in the West are finally starting to get the hang of this. And when Macron made those comments, the German Chancellor Olaf got a little agitated about it, and he went out, I think this was earlier today also, and said this.
NATO is not and will not be party to the war. That remains the case. We do not want Russia's war against Ukraine to become a war between Russia and NATO. We agree on this with all our allies. This also means no German participation in the war.
And he went on there to say, which has caused no small issues in Europe, he, in that same press conference there, said, we're not going to give the Ukraine side long-range missiles, like many have been talking about. They've been wanting to do the Taurus missile. You may have heard something about that, because it would require German soldiers to help operate them and to fire them on the ground, like he said, the UK and the French people who also gave long-range missiles. And he admitted right there in front of everybody in the public that there are French and UK soldiers on the ground in Ukraine engaging in actions that are killing Russian people. So it's yet to see what the Russians are going to do about that. But it just many, and especially the UK and in France, were just beside themselves in anger at the German chancellor. So there's more bad blood going back and forth across there. Not that the Russians, I don't think, didn't know that. It's not a surprise that you can't get something that's a very technical capability like that and think that you're just going to hand some missiles off to some country that's never had it and that they're going to be able to use it with precision right away without somebody on the ground. So I don't think that's going to come as a shock, but it did come as a shock to many in the West that, hey, hang on, you mean there already are some NATO troops on the ground fighting or providing help, soldiers, on behalf of the Ukraine military to attack Russia? That's what's happening now. And so Schultz wants no part of that because they want to resist Russia. They don't want Russia to win. But he also says, hey, there are some lines here. There's some places I'm not going to go, and we're not going to give them this capability. We're not going to get involved. That's not on the table. Macron said it is on the table. For Schultz, it's not. And just as a reminder, Article 5 is an attack on one, is this viewed as an attack on all. There is no provision for an offensive attack against another country that would require anyone else to do anything. Let's be clear on that. So there are no offensive Article 5 provisions. So if anybody does something, they could very much find themselves on their own. But we'll talk about that more in a future segment here. But right now, my concern is you see the German chancellor, and he's been accused of being weak. And, a lot of people have laughed at him because he's so waffly. But at least he's taken a stand here, and at least he's acknowledging reality on the ground to protect his national interest. Would that America would do the same kind of thing? But unfortunately, we don't seem to be. So let me show you something from a few days back here by Jake Sullivan, who is very much not looking at reality.
Of course, Ukraine can win. Of course, Ukraine has already succeeded militarily in one of the most profound objectives it had, which was to keep the country from falling into Russian hands. It has already done that. And Ukraine can go further in retaking territory that Russia has occupied, but it can only do so if it has the tools that it needs.
Okay, that's just nonsense, as I've detailed for you many times. It's not an issue of money. It's not an issue of machines. It's an issue of manpower for Ukraine. They don't have the manpower to engage in a sustained attrition-like warfare with Russia over time. They just don't. They've performed heroically, and he's right about that. They did perform heroically, especially in that first year, and exceeded all expectations. But that's a tactical and even an operational success that they had. It's not a strategic one. The strategic power remains with Russia where it started with Russia, and why you can't win a war. A battle is one thing. You can win some battles, but you can't win the war if you don't have the fundamentals, national combat power underpinning your side. Ukraine doesn't. But Jake Sullivan is just going to turn blind eye to that. Well, that's not surprising because his boss does too. About a week or so ago, Biden went before the American people and made this commercial style appeal.
We have to stand up to Putin and pass the national bipartisan bill, the National Security Bill, supporting Ukraine as they defend themselves against Putin's vicious onslaught, and prove to the world once more America can't be relied on. We stand strong with our allies. We have to remember who we are. We're the United States of America. We keep our commitments. We never walk away from our friends. And we sure as hell don't bow down to Vladimir Putin. We're the United States of America, for God's sake. The most powerful nation in the history, not in the world, in the history of the world. The history of the world.
It seems that he actually believes that. It seems that he believes that we are the most powerful nation in the history of the world. Ergo, we can do whatever we want. If there's an outcome we desire, we'll get it because we desire it. Doesn't matter looking at the fundamentals. It doesn't matter looking at the ground truth reality. We'll just get it because we want it. And we're not going to, folks. We do live in reality. Whether they want to accept it or not, whether Jake Sullivan wants to recognize it or not, the president of the United States or all these other folks who keep trying to tell you the same kinds of things, that we just need to give money. It's just the tools, as Jake said. We just need this bill to be passed, said the White House, implying that the only thing holding them back right now, dang it, it's just that bill. If we had another big wad of cash to throw, everything's going to turn around. There is no truth to that, folks. And it doesn't take much to figure this out. 200 plus billion, thousands upon thousands of armored vehicles, other weapons of war. There were ammunition, missiles, rockets, air defense interceptors, now tanks, soon F-16s, but there's been other fighters that have been donated by other countries. None of those have made any difference. Now, why should anyone have the slightest belief that $60 billion more when the Ukraine side is being rolled back all across the front line? They have utterly failed to have any success in our offensive. And now that it doesn't even look like they're going to be able to hold on to what they have, that somehow $60 billion is going to make any difference. It won't. And in fact, that's one thing that they've never told you. Whether it's Jake Sullivan, John Kirby, the President Biden, no one has ever said, if we get this money, it's going to produce this. And by having that thing, it's going to change the dynamics on the ground because XYZ. Here's what Russia's doing. Here's what Ukraine's trying to do. And with just this, here's how it will enable them to succeed, because there is no such thing. Russia, as I've told you the other day, the best that we're going to get is, irrespective of that $60 billion, is the cumulative West will produce about 1.3 million artillery shells this year. Russia will produce 4.5 million on its own, and apparently it's going to get up to 3 million total by the end of this year from North Korea of the same kind that they use, the 152 millimeters. So any way you want to count it, even if they got everything, they're still going to be woefully inaccurate. And of course, the longer the time goes on, the more that they're going to create and will never, ever catch up. So just having more artillery shells isn't going to change anything. It may raise the cost on the Russian side a little bit, but it won't change the outcome. No one in the West wants to tell you that. They just claim that by giving this money, it's going to make a difference. But as we're seeing on the ground, it's not. And I'm about to show you how graphically true that is. But there's one more person I want to show you who also is not dealing with reality, and that is Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. Earlier this month, he came before his people and before the world and said that he was going to make a change in his leadership. And here's what he told everybody.
Відсьогодні до керівництва Збройними силами України приступає нова управлінська команда. Я призначив генерал-полковника Сирського головнокомандувачем Збройних сил України. Очікую, найближчим часом на столі має з'явитись реалістичний, детальний план дій Збройних сил України на 2024 рік.
Okay, so let me explain to you a little bit what's going on there. So he replaced General Zaluzhny, who had been the commander-in-chief of the ground forces, or the armed forces, rather, since the outset of the war, since it started. He got fired, I guess, last month, basically, officially. Although it had been rumored long before that, because Zelensky was not satisfied with how things were going. So he brings on this new guy, Syrskyi, and says, okay, now we're going to get a big change. Now we're going to start doing things differently. And he's demanding this, action plan for 2024 and all this kind of stuff. Days after Syrskyi took command, he made a statement that says, we're going to hold on to Avdiivka, and we're going to send in more reserves. And Zelensky backed him up and said, yes, we're going to send stuff to them. We're going to back them up so that they have everything that they need so that they can continue to hold Avdiivka. It'll be the new fortress. It had been a fortress since at least 2014. It's where they put all their effort into doing it. 2 days later, the city falls, and it falls in dramatic fashion. And a good portion of that, reports are starting to now come out a little bit more on the Ukraine side, especially among their Telegram channels, that are saying part of the reason it fell is because the troops lost confidence in the leadership. They believed in Zaluzhny, because Zaluzhny, for his mistakes, and he has made some, he at least said, let's get out of some of these cities earlier than they did, like in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk in 2022. He said he wanted to get out even before the end of 2022 from Bakhmut. No one listened to him. They stayed and they fought to the end and lost tens of thousands of troops unnecessarily and still lost the city. That was then repeated again at the end of last year. Toward the end of last year in the autumn, Zaluzhny said, look, the offensive didn't work. We gave it every shot. It's not going to work. We need to now convert over to the defense. We need to start building these belts of defensive lines, just like the Russians did the previous year, so that they can't continue the invasion through us, and then we'll figure it out from there. That's why Zelensky said, no, that's not what I want to do. Don't go on the defensive. So he did not allow Zaluzhny to build defensive lines in the Ukraine side. So he said, no, we're going to keep going on the offense. Zaluzhny wanted to, but he was overridden. He's not the elected leader. So that's what they did. They did not build the defenses. They did try to stay on the offensive. Now they're paying the price, because now then that Avdiivka has fallen, now then they're falling back on previous lines, but they're not as elaborate as what the Russians had built them in 2022. So they're trying like crazy to build those at the same time they're trying to defend, which is an incredibly difficult thing to do. But now, as we're starting to see, this headline was in today's Newsweek, that no, in fact, the front line is collapsing. And it is, if you read the article there, you find out that it's actually in danger of completely falling apart by the summer in some estimates. It's really a hard, it's more an art than it is a science. It's not something you can count or, based on how many men they have, how many tanks, because there's so many things that go into it. So it's impossible to tell. They could hold out throughout the whole summer, as far as I know, or they may not even make it out of April or May. Those are both equally possible. And I just don't have enough knowledge on this side of the world to be able to say that, unless I went on the ground and observed the will of the troops and all that and found out ground truth. So it's impossible to say. But what's not impossible to say is that the chances of them hanging on beyond much the end of the summer is just almost non-existent. Look, here's a map from the Institute for the Study of War, and one of the biggest areas of the war here in the Donetsk area. And you see that all those green areas there are where the Russians are on the attack. And in all the yellow area you see inside each of those, that's where Russia is continuing to take new territory. Everywhere you look, and all the other areas that are put on there by the ISW also show the same thing, is that it's just not going to, there's nowhere that Ukraine is even standing firm. And because they failed to dig in their defensive and to build these elaborate multi-belt defensive positions like the Russians did, the Russians now have a chance to break through there. It matters as to whether Russia has enough combat power of its own to continue the pressure. Again, we don't know for sure. We have anecdotal evidence, but it looks like the Russians do have that capacity. And we certainly know they have the firepower because, like I said, their ammunition, especially in drones, in rockets, missiles, and artillery shells, are all on the increase. Whereas the Ukraine side, they're on the decrease, and they're just running short of every category of ammunition because it can't be produced fast enough if there was money, and the nations that have them aren't willing to give them up in case they need it, which is reasonable. And you see, like the Chancellor of Germany, he draws a line when his national security is at stake. So far, the U.S. hasn't drawn any lines. They're still trying to give everything away. But I think that those days are going to come to an end. And you know, I keep saying over and over that these things were so predictable and that we could have avoided so many of these negative outcomes. We could have avoided the war from coming at all if we just insisted that Ukraine negotiate and the Kiev before the war started, when they could have maintained nominal control of everything, that they should have made a negotiated settlement when the war started, especially in Istanbul. There was a golden opportunity. We didn't press that issue. In fact, there's some reports that we were actually encouraging the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson to encourage Zelensky not to make a negotiated settlement. Only history will know how much of that is true. We don't know. Boris Johnson denies that took place. All we do know is that there was a good shot for peace and that the Ukraine side nixed it and went away from it. And since that time, they've been at war ever since. So the question now is, what are we going to do? Are our leaders finally going to do something that makes sense, like the German chancellor is doing there, and look out for American national interest and recognize belatedly what is really possible and what is not? Or are we going to keep our eyes closed and say, no, we're the greatest power in the history of the world. We're going to keep going. Even in light of, as you see on your screen here, this is from yesterday, the day before Putin makes the speech that I just showed you a minute ago from earlier today, where he says, hey, if this goes nuclear, we're ready to do it, but it's going to be lures. So they're rolling around these nuclear missiles in their cities openly, putting cameras out there. He wants to make sure people are aware. They're physically moving these things around. That's not an empty threat that we should just ignore, that somehow they don't mean it. Even though Putin has meant so many of the other things he said about military, don't play with this. I'm going to leave you with an episode here, or a segment of an episode we recently had with John Mearsheimer. And it's really so painful because he's gonna take a look at what we could have done, and the fact that we see now there are nuclear missiles rolling around the Russian countryside. We separately had a week or so ago the president of Russia flying around in a Tu-160 nuclear bomber, flying over their airspace, which is where they would launch nuclear weapons from. That's just happened recently. You see February 22nd on that one, about a week ago. That's where we are right now. We're on the cusp of, if we don't stop being stupid, those things could go further. And if one of those gets dropped by either side, then all hell is going to break loose, and the world as we know it will never be the same. But here's what's ironic. I'm going to let John tag us out on this one today, because he says, here's what could have been the case instead.
I mean, if you think about this, if we had created a neutral Ukraine, let me put it differently. Ukraine was, according to its constitution and its declaration of sovereignty in 1990, a neutral country. It abandoned neutrality in December of 2014. Just think about that. So if we had left it alone, Ukraine would be intact today to include Crimea. Just think about that. All these dead people would not be dead.
And what I worry about is the people who are still alive today and who may not be if we keep the fiction going. I pray to God that that kind of common sense that John talked about there, that the belated self-interest of the Germans that they're showing soon makes its way into Washington, and we take action to end the war, end the bloodshed, and end the risk of stumbling into a nuclear conflict with Russia. All of those things would be bad for us if it goes into, and everything would be good for the Ukrainian people and the American people if we take that path. We'll see. We're going to continue to watch this, and we'll bring you up to date on all the developments as they continue to happen, as they do. We ask that you want to join us later this afternoon, I believe at about 4 p.m., 4 or 4:30 p.m. We'll publish it shortly. We're going to do another episode on some breaking events coming out of the Middle East this afternoon. I encourage you to watch this because there's some things that are developing there that are, again, just hard to understand how we're into this point here, how America is supporting things that are happening to this egregious nature in the Middle East, especially in the Gaza Strip area. And I'll lay out some points of what we ought to do instead. But be sure and watch that. Like and subscribe and share this with your friends so that they realize that we are unintimidated and uncompromised. No matter what the truth is, you're going to get it right here. Thanks, and we'll see you shortly on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.